Daniel Hayes walked into his home with the kind of tired satisfaction that comes from winning a particularly grueling negotiation. The deal had been one of the hardest of his career, but closing it would mean a massive boost for his firm. As he placed his briefcase by the door, the scent of vanilla candles greeted him, mingling with the faint aroma of wine. Clara had lit them again, a habit she'd picked up recently. For a moment he smiled, savoring the promise of a quiet evening. Then he noticed an empty wine glass, a faint lipstick stain on the rim. The second glass stood nearby, untouched. He felt the shift in the air, a barely perceptible dissonance in what should have been the rhythm of their home. "Clara," he called out, forcing a casual tone. In here, her voice floated from the living room, light and carefree. The same voice that used to chase away his bad days. But tonight, something felt off. He walked in to find her reclining on the couch, a glossy magazine spread across her lap. She wore a silk robe loosely tied at the waist, revealing smooth, tanned legs crossed at the ankle. Her hair, long and dark, cascaded over her shoulders, framing her perfect smile. If he didn't know better, he would have thought she was waiting for him. Daniel smiled back, but the warmth didn't reach his eyes. "Celebrating without me." She laughed, a sound that used to be his favorite melody. "Just a glass. You were late." The conversation flowed, seemingly ordinary. But as they spoke, he saw how her eyes darted to the side, how her laugh lingered a fraction too long. There was a brittleness beneath her charm, a tension she tried too hard to mask. Something cold unfurled in his gut. Later that night, as Clara slept beside him, her breath soft and even, Daniel lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The memory of the second glass gnawed at him. He told himself it was nothing, maybe a friend had come by. Maybe it was nothing at all, but doubt had already planted its seed. The next morning, Daniel left for work early. At his office, he buried himself in case files and legal briefs, but Clara's laugh kept echoing in his mind, hollow and forced. By afternoon, he'd had enough. He placed a call to a friend, a private investigator he'd worked with on a corporate espionage case years ago. Discreet, he insisted, his voice low. "I need this done quietly." The days that followed were hell. Daniel kept up appearances at work and at home, smiling when he needed to, laughing when appropriate. But inside, he was unraveling, every minute waiting for a report that might confirm or dispel his fears. It came on a Thursday. He returned from court to find a plain manila envelope waiting on his desk. His hands trembled as he opened it. Inside were photos, timestamps, places he recognized. The hotel where he and Clara had once celebrated their anniversary. The cafe where they shared Sunday mornings. In every image, there she was, tangled up with a man whose face he knew all too well, Nathan, a self-styled entrepreneur who'd been at their dinner parties, shaking hands with Daniel while stealing glances at Clara when he thought no one was watching. Daniel stared at the evidence until the edges of the photos blurred. The room felt too small, his breath too shallow. Rage coursed through him, hot and violent, demanding an outlet. He wanted to storm home, to confront her, to scream and break things until he felt something other than this gnawing, consuming betrayal. But he didn't. He didn't. Instead, he picked up every photo, every piece of evidence, and tucked it back into the envelope. He locked it in his drawer and sat back, eyes fixed on the window overlooking the city skyline. Clara had betrayed him, lied to him, laughed in his face while carrying on with another man. But rage wasn't enough. Not for what she had done. Revenge, he decided, would be a far better response. And he wouldn't be sloppy about it. No screaming confrontations, no crude outbursts of fury. He would tear her life apart, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but the ashes of her own choices. And when she finally understood the depth of her mistake, he would make sure she knew whose hands had built her ruin. That night, he came home and kissed her on the cheek just as he always did. He asked her about her day. He listened to her lies. He smiled, already planning. In the coming weeks, he would become a husband she couldn't read, a careful mixture of warmth and distance. Every word, every gesture was calculated. She thought she was safe, that she had escaped unscathed. But she was wrong. The game had just begun. Daniel moved through the days like a man possessed, his outer calm masking the storm that raged beneath. Each morning, he played the part of the devoted husband, memorizing every detail of Clara's routine, her morning jogs, the texts she claimed were from friends, the half-hearted excuses about late meetings. Every gesture, every lie she told, became another data point in his rapidly growing plan. The first step was to keep her comfortable. He showered her with affection, surprising her with flowers at work, arranging dinners at their favorite restaurants. Clara was initially wary, perhaps suspecting he'd sensed something amiss, but Daniel's consistency wore her down. She smiled more often, laughed easily, even leaned in to kiss him with a passion that was almost believable. She believed she had him fooled, and for now he needed her to think that. Behind the scenes, he spared no effort. The private investigator he'd hired, a man named Colin Graves, became a fixture in Daniel's life. Together, they pored over Clara's movements and dug deeper into Nathan's activities. Colin delivered new findings, almost daily hotel receipts, late-night rendezvous, and photographs that revealed more than Daniel ever wanted to know. Each new revelation drove him deeper into cold, methodical resolve. One evening, Colin brought him a recording. Daniel played it alone in his study, the dim light casting long shadows on the walls. The audio crackled to life, Clara's voice, unmistakable, filled with laughter and affection as she spoke to Nathan. "He's clueless," she said, her tone dripping with derision. "He thinks everything is perfect. It's almost sad." Daniel clenched his jaw until it hurt. He replayed the recording, over and over, until the words lost their meaning. His wife, the woman who'd vowed to love and cherish him, mocked him behind closed doors. It wasn't just betrayal, it was contempt. And it deserved punishment far beyond a fleeting confrontation. He began to strategize, using his skills as a lawyer to construct the perfect plan. Clara had always prided herself on her professional reputation. She ran a successful PR firm, cultivating connections with influential clients and media figures. It was her armor, her source of pride. Daniel decided it would be the first thing he stripped away. With Colin's help, he began leaking whispers to key figures in Clara's network. Anonymous emails hinted at professional misconduct and ethical breaches, all carefully crafted to raise suspicion without leading back to him. Clara started noticing. Meetings were canceled, clients were suddenly unavailable, and her trusted colleagues grew distant. He watched as she tried to hide her frustration, plastering on a smile even as her world tilted. At home, he became the attentive partner. "Rough day?" he'd ask, his voice full of concern. She'd nod, sometimes blinking back tears. "Nothing I can't handle," she'd reply, trying to maintain her facade. He'd pull her close, whispering reassurances, all while savoring the cracks forming in her composure. The financial sabotage came next. Clara had always prided herself on her independence, her own accounts, investments, and assets. Daniel dug into every detail, leveraging his connections to freeze funds, reroute payments, and quietly siphon money out of her control. It started small, just enough to make her question herself. A misplaced payment here, an unexpected fee there. But soon, the discrepancies grew impossible to ignore. One evening, she confronted him, eyes wide with panic. "Something's wrong with the accounts. I think someone's targeting me." "Are you sure?" he asked, feigning concern. "We can call the bank tomorrow." "Tomorrow?" Her voice trembled. "This could ruin everything, Daniel. I've worked too hard." "We'll fix it." He squeezed her hand, offering the perfect blend of reassurance and detachment. "I promise." Inwardly, he savored every moment of her fear. He wanted her to feel it, the helplessness, the uncertainty. He wanted her to know what it was like to have the ground shift beneath her feet. As Clara scrambled to regain control of her finances, Daniel turned his attention to Nathan. He'd learned enough about the man to know that his business dealings weren't just unethical, they were illegal. A network of shell companies, fraudulent contracts, and backdoor deals painted a picture that, once exposed, would lead to ruin. Daniel began compiling evidence, reaching out to contacts in law enforcement, ensuring every move he made was untraceable. Nathan was a distraction, a man who thought he could steal what wasn't his. But Daniel's real target remained Clara. He used every tool at his disposal: fake messages, planted evidence, and anonymous tips to turn her and Nathan against each other. He orchestrated a confrontation at a hotel, ensuring they'd be caught together by a colleague of Clara's who was known for gossip. By the next day, their affair was no longer a secret, it was a scandal. When Clara returned home that night, her face pale and drawn, Daniel was waiting. "Rough day?" he asked, the same question he'd used so many times before. She stared at him, her eyes hollow. "You heard." Everyone heard. He poured her a glass of wine, watching her hands shake as she took it. "I'm sorry." "Are you?" she whispered, her voice brittle. She searched his face for a hint of judgment, a flicker of blame, but he gave her nothing. In the days that followed, Clara's life spiraled. Clients terminated contracts, her closest friends distanced themselves, and Nathan, desperate to save himself, threw her under the bus in every way possible. The Puerto Rico firm she'd spent years building teetered on the edge of collapse. Through it all, Daniel remained by her side, the supportive husband offering empty reassurances while secretly pulling the strings. As her desperation grew, Clara clung to him, unable to see the truth. She confessed everything one night, sobbing into his chest. "I'm sorry," she said over and over. "I was stupid. I was selfish. Please, please don't leave me." He stroked her hair, murmuring soft words. "I'm here," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "I'm not going anywhere." But inside he felt nothing but contempt. The next phase was more brutal. With his lawyer's expertise, Daniel initiated divorce proceedings. He presented a mountain of evidence, proof of her affair, financial mismanagement, and more, ensuring that she would walk away with nothing. When Clara tried to fight, he unleashed every weapon at his disposal: private recordings, falsified documents, and relentless legal pressure that left her broken and defeated. On the day the court finalized their divorce, she approached him in the hallway, her eyes bloodshot and empty. "Was this all you wanted?" she asked, her voice a whisper. "To destroy me." Daniel looked at her for a long moment. "No," he said quietly. "I wanted you to feel everything I felt." He walked away, leaving her standing alone. The divorce was only the beginning of Clara's descent. Daniel had made sure of it. While the court's decision left her financially ruined, the real devastation came afterward, in the form of a relentless series of targeted blows that stripped away everything she still clung to. Clara's social connections, once her most valuable asset, vanished as quickly as her wealth. Whispers of the scandal followed her wherever she went, ensuring she was met with closed doors and turned backs. She tried to rebuild, but every effort was quietly undermined. Jobs she applied for fell through after anonymous calls exposed ethics violations. Business partnerships dissolved before they could be formalized. At first, she assumed it was the fallout of her own actions. But as the failures piled up, she started to suspect that someone was still pulling the strings. Her suspicions were confirmed late one evening when she received a message, an untraceable number, a single sentence. "It's not over." Clara stared at the glowing screen, dread pooling in her stomach. She knew exactly who was behind it. Daniel hadn't simply moved on. He was still watching, still dismantling everything she tried to rebuild. Her attempts to confront him were met with cold indifference. She showed up at his office one afternoon, unannounced, her face drawn and hollow. His receptionist looked uncomfortable but allowed her through. When she entered, Daniel barely looked up from the documents spread across his desk. "Clara," he said, his voice devoid of warmth. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" "You've made your point," she said, her voice trembling with desperation and rage. "You've taken everything. When will it be enough?" He leaned back in his chair, studying her with detached amusement. "Enough? You think this is about retribution?" He paused, letting the silence stretch. "I'm simply holding you accountable." "Accountable?" she repeated, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. "You've ruined me, Daniel. Her voice cracked. "Isn't that enough?" "You ruined yourself." His words were ice. "I just made sure everyone else saw it." The truth hit her like a slap. There was no winning this argument. She left his office feeling more defeated than ever, the realization settling in he wasn't going to stop. He would haunt every attempt she made to rise again, casting shadows over her life until there was nothing left. Nathan's fate, meanwhile, was no kinder. Thanks to Daniel's careful leaks, every dark secret in Nathan's business dealings was brought to light. Investigations were opened, assets seized, and high-powered allies distanced themselves to save their own reputations. Cornered and desperate, Nathan tried to pin the blame on Clara, portraying her as a willing accomplice in his schemes. She denied everything, but the damage was done. Nathan's betrayal was the final nail in her coffin. As Nathan's empire crumbled, Daniel made one final move to ensure the man's complete ruin. He orchestrated a series of anonymous tips that led the authorities straight to Nathan's last hidden assets. The resulting raid left Nathan with nothing but debts and a growing list of criminal charges. In the end, the man who had once stood so smugly at Clara's side was reduced to begging for leniency, his pride shattered. Clara's life continued to spiral. She lost her home, the mansion she once shared with Daniel sold at auction. She moved into a small apartment, the kind of place she used to look down on. Her days were a haze of rejection letters, unpaid bills, and cold stares from strangers who recognized her as the woman from the scandal. Once, she caught sight of herself in a shop window and barely recognized the gaunt, defeated woman staring back. She felt hollow, like all the things that had once made her vibrant were gone. Months later, she saw Daniel one last time. She was walking out of a grocery store, clutching a bag of essentials she could barely afford. The sight of him, sharp suit, confident stride, stopped her in her tracks. He hadn't seen her yet, but when he did, their eyes met across the parking lot. For a moment, neither moved. Then, slowly, he walked over. Clara felt the urge to run, to hide, but pride or whatever scraps of it remained rooted her in place. He stopped a few feet away, his expression unreadable. Up close, he looked the same, and yet entirely different. Colder. Harder. "Daniel," she said, her voice weak. Clara, his tone was as icy as she remembered. There was no hatred in his eyes, no triumph, just emptiness. She swallowed. "You've won." "I have nothing left." He tilted his head, as if considering her words. "I didn't do this to win," he said finally. "I did it to end what you started." The words hung heavy between them. She wanted to beg for mercy, to ask for some semblance of the man she once knew, the man she betrayed, to show compassion. But there was no point. This was the endgame. She had destroyed him first, but he had taken her apart piece by piece. "Goodbye, Clara," he said, turning without waiting for her response. As she watched him walk away, she realized there would be no redemption, no rising from the ashes. Her choices had brought her here, and now all that remained was the ruin she'd made of herself. Daniel, meanwhile, climbed into his car and closed the door behind him. For a moment, he gripped the steering wheel tightly, feeling the weight of everything he had done. Revenge had consumed him, and he'd taken it as far as it could go. There was no joy in this ending, no satisfaction in seeing Claire reduced to nothing. But there was closure. Cold, hollow closure. He started the engine and drove away, leaving Clara and everything she represented behind.